I have lived with this woman for 40 years, and only now, at 81, can I honestly say I did something to her worse than betrayal or murder. I never raised a hand against her, but she stopped living long before her death. My morning in Boston on Louisburg Square begins with a silence that carries the weight of a court transcript. This is not the blessed silence of peace that they write about in cheap novels, but a sterile absence of sound that occurs when all extra variables are removed from life. I wake up at 6:30, a habit that neither retirement nor arthritis could kill. My body is an old, worn-out code of laws. The skin on my hands is thin, like the parchment of documents from the 1970s, and my veins stand out like the blue ink used to sign the death warrants of someone's fortune. I am a lawyer. Even now, when my name on the firm's sign, Armitage and Partners, is covered with the patina of time, I remain one in every movement. I don't just drink coffee. I enter into an agreement with it to maintain vital functions for the next 3 hours. Every item in this house, from the massive mahogany table to the antique clock that strikes the seconds with the inexorability of a judge's gavel, has passed through my strict inventory. Occupational hazard is when you cannot look at the sunlight falling on the carpet without calculating the damages from the wool fading. I look at the living room and see not comfort, but a collection of assets. A chair is an investment. A crystal chandelier is an obligation for cleaning. And the emptiness on the other side of the table is the absence of an object that I so carefully edited for 40 years. Evelyn was my most difficult case. I always followed the theory of emotional frugality. You see, most people scatter feelings like profligate bankrupts. They pour out tenderness, support, and admiration, not realizing that emotional resource is an exhaustible deposit. I, however, believed that for a stable marriage, it was enough to provide security, impeccable social status, and logic. Why spend the gold of hugs when you can pay with the silver of new jewelry or the platinum of Swiss bank accounts? Emotions are entropy. I, on the other hand, craved order. Her easel still stands in the corner of the office, covered with a gray canvas like seized real estate. Evelyn painted. She saw the world in spots of light and shadow, in illogical splashes of color that irritated my legal soul with their inaccuracy. I often approached her while she was working and pointed out the mistakes. Evelyn, I would say, the anatomy of a human shoulder does not allow for such a curve. It is implausible. Fix it. I corrected her paintings just as I corrected weak points in contracts. I beat the implausibility out of her, not realizing that along with it, I was beating out her life. Now I live among these corrected things. My house is a perfectly calibrated space where there is no room for chaos, but also no room for breathing. Even the air here seems canned. I pick up my old Mont Blanc pen, my stiletto, my scalpel, and feel its coldness. It is heavy. It remembers thousands of edits. Today my gaze fell on an old stain on the oak floor near the fireplace. A bowl once stood there. This was the only case when a virus of irrationality penetrated my system. A stray kitten. Evelyn found it in the rain near the back entrance. It was wretched, dirty, devoid of any legal or aesthetic value, just a ball of wet fur that disturbed the harmony of my hallway. I remember how she held it, and her eyes shone with that dangerous, uncontrollable light that I always tried to curb. She asked to keep it. She asked for an exception to the rules. But rules know no exceptions. They only know precedence. If you allow one weakness, another will follow. Emotional inflation is inevitable. I look at my hands. They are shaking, not from fear, no, just the mechanics wearing out. I look at the empty walls where her canvases used to hang, those that I allowed to remain after my edits. They were flawless from the perspective of composition, but absolutely dead. I made them that way. I cultivated in her this scarcity of lines, which was a reflection of my own emotional scarcity. I gave her everything, the best paints, trips to Tuscany for nature, houses, protection. I was the ideal guardian. But I never once told her that her art made my heart beat faster, because it didn't. I did not allow myself such a luxury. The heart is a pump, not a musical instrument. At least that is what I convinced myself for all these decades. Now, at 81, I am the owner of a vast archive of silence. Every piece of furniture in this room looks at me with silent reproach, like witnesses I intimidated during cross-examination. Occupational hazard has made my life into a flawlessly drafted lawsuit against myself. I stand up, leaning on a cane with a knob in the shape of an eagle's head. The metal is cold. Everything around is cold. The emotional deficit that I so diligently created became my only legacy. I saved on love, and now I am the richest man in the cemetery of unspoken words. There, outside the window, the Boston fog swallows the outlines of the trees, and here, inside, I prepare for a meeting with the past, which I so skillfully corrected once, not knowing that some corrections are fatal. I will remember that day, the day of the operation, the day I finally became the architect of her misery, sincerely believing that I was building a temple of her greatness. I look at my clean hands and feel the weight of a scalpel that hasn't been in them for 30 years. But now I am forced to return to that night when I first decided I had the right to rewrite her fate. Do you think crimes are committed in dark alleys? No. The most terrible murders happen under the light of expensive chandeliers with the best of intentions. Wait until I tell you exactly how I began to destroy her. The rain in Boston can be cruel. It doesn't just fall, it attacks the city, washing away the remnants of warmth from the brick walls of Back Bay. I returned from the office, carrying in my briefcase a draft agreement for the merger of two steel giants. My thoughts were structured like the grid of a cathedral, every article, every paragraph in its place. But as soon as I opened the heavy oak doors, the harmony was broken. Evelyn stood in the middle of the hall. She was barefoot, her blonde hair was disheveled, and a dirty stain was spreading on her expensive cashmere dress. In her hands she clutched this creature, a small, scrawny kitten that was shivering so hard it seemed as if it would fall apart into atoms. "Arthur, look!" Her voice was dangerously high, filled with that irrational vibration I couldn't stand. It was dying right on the sidewalk. This is a sign. We must keep it. I didn't answer immediately. I slowly took off my coat, straightened my shoulders, and looked at her the way I look at an intern who has made a gross error in citing a precedent. Silence is my best tool. It creates a vacuum that the opponent tries to fill with fuss, revealing their weak points. "Evelyn," I finally said, and my voice sounded like a blade coming out of its scabbard. "Objectively, this creature is a carrier of infections. It will destroy the interior, and most importantly, it will require a resource from you that you do not have. You are an artist. Your concentration is your capital. You cannot squander it on biological trash." "It's not trash, it's life," she cried out, and in her eyes I saw what required immediate surgical intervention, emotional excess, a fire that could incinerate that ideal version of her personality I had so diligently built. I stepped closer. The kitten squeaked, a thin, piercing sound that broke the silence of my home. I felt physical pain from this sound, as if someone had run sandpaper across my brain. "Let's go to your studio," I said quietly. "We need to talk about your new painting." I knew that art was her only vulnerability through which I could manipulate her reality. We went upstairs. She left the kitten in a basket by the fireplace, naively believing that the issue was settled. In the studio, an unfinished portrait stood on the easel. She had been working on it for weeks. It was a woman looking out the window, and there was so much frantic hope in her pose that the painting seemed vulgar to me. It was too alive, too chaotic. It fell outside the framework of that high, restrained art that I planned to present to my partners at the annual exhibition. I took a palette knife from the table, a thin steel spatula with a flexible blade. It was cold and sharp. In my hands, this instrument turned into a scalpel. "Do you know why this work is weak, Evelyn?" I began to slowly walk around the easel. "Because there is too much of you in it. Your weakness, your pity. You want to save the cat because you yourself feel imperfect. But art is discipline. It is the carving away of the redundant." I brought the palette knife to the canvas. She caught her breath. "If you keep this object," I nodded toward the door where the kitten remained downstairs, "you will never finish this painting correctly. Your hand will become soft. Your vision will be clouded by sentimentality. You choose. Either a momentary emotional surge that will die in 10 years along with this animal, or eternity in a canvas that I will help you bring to perfection." It was a big lie wrapped in the golden foil of care. I didn't want her eternity. I wanted to control her. I wanted her world to close in on me, not on external irritants that required love. Love is a tax on time, and I had no intention of paying it. "Arthur, don't," she whispered, looking at the steel in my hand. "I'm doing this for your own good. As a lawyer, I see the consequences. As your husband, I am protecting your talent from yourself." I made a sharp motion. The palette knife didn't cut the canvas. No, that would have been too crude. I began scraping the layer of still wet paint off the woman's face in the painting. I scraped away her smile, her hope, her wrong curve of the lips. It was the sound of metal rubbing against fabric, dry, like the rattle of a dying person. Evelyn cried out and covered her face with her hands. "See?" I said, continuing the operation. "Now there is emptiness here, a clean, sterile plane. From it we will create something real, without tears, without unnecessary nerves." I set aside the palette knife. On its blade remained a brown mass of paint, resembling clotted blood. "The kitten will go to a shelter tonight. I have already called a car. This is not up for discussion. This is a condition for your purity as an artist. You will thank me later, Evelyn. When your works are in the Metropolitan, you will remember this evening as the moment you got rid of the ballast." She didn't cry. She just lowered her hands and looked at me. In her gaze was something that I then took for submission. Now I know it was the extinguishing of a fire. I turned off the light in her soul, convincing her that this way she would better see the darkness necessary for high style. I left the room feeling triumphant. I had saved her from irrationality. I had preserved our emotional budget. I was the ideal architect of her success, not noticing that instead of a foundation, I had laid dynamite of coldness under our home. That night, she didn't come to the bedroom. She sat in the studio, in front of the ruined canvas, while the kitten had long since been driven into the night, into the rain, into the unknown. I fell asleep with a sense of duty fulfilled. I was a surgeon who had removed a tumor of feelings so that the patient could live forever. After that evening in the attic, after my surgical intervention into her creative chaos, Evelyn changed. It wasn't an explosion, not a tantrum or an open rebellion. I would have known how to work with such legal categories. No, it was a slow, capillary erosion of the soul. She became perfect. She became exactly the woman I could have included in any declaration as a most valuable asset, restrained, exquisite, with professionally polished manners that did not allow for a single emotional error. My plan of emotional frugality worked flawlessly. I convinced myself that love is not something given, but something invested. I provided her with a life millions dreamed of, a house in a prestigious neighborhood where neighbors spoke only of stocks and charity balls, a wardrobe from the best couturiers, where every fabric was so expensive it was frightening to touch it with a dirty thought, and, of course, a career. She truly began to paint differently. Her canvases became cold. Critics called it metaphysical realism, or the geometry of loneliness. They saw a deep philosophical subtext in her paintings, not suspecting it was simply an absence of oxygen. She painted deserts, frozen oceans, empty rooms where sunlight fell on the floor with surgical precision, without warming a single atom of air. I was delighted. I bought the best frames, organized exhibitions in galleries in New York and London. I felt like Pygmalion, who hadn't just brought stone to life, but had taught stone to be prestigious. "Your new works are a triumph of logic over chaos," I told her at breakfast, cutting my toast into perfectly even squares. "You have finally discarded everything redundant." She looked at me with her light eyes where sunbeams used to dance, but now ice had frozen. She only nodded. "Yes, Arthur, the redundant is no more." She stopped asking for hugs. She stopped laughing for no reason when she saw a funny bird on the windowsill in the morning. My strategy of frugality turned out to be so successful that she herself began to save on herself. I gave her diamonds. She wore them like shackles, with cold dignity. I offered her travels. She agreed, but in Rome or Paris, she looked like a tourist in her own life, carefully noting architectural details, but never once inhaling the smell of street food or the scent of a spring chestnut. Our evenings in Boston became a ritual of silence. We sat in the office, I with my acts and lawsuits, she with her sketchbook. Lamps with green shades cast a deathly light on her face. I sometimes looked up and saw her drawing. Her fingers, once smeared with paint, were now always impeccably clean. Her strokes became short, abrupt, as if she were afraid to leave too much pigment on the canvas. She saved on color. She saved on breath. I remember one winter when she fell ill. It was a mild cold, but she looked as if her internal supports had suddenly rotted away. I brought her medicine, the best doctor, expensive fruits. I acted as the ideal guardian. "Do you need anything, Evelyn?" I asked, standing by her bed in an impeccable suit. She looked at me, and for a moment that old, unfixed suffering flashed in her gaze. She reached out her hand, thin, almost transparent, with blue veins resembling rivers on an old map. "Arthur," Just stay here. Hold my hand. Tell me something, not about business. Tell me something warm. I felt a fuse blow inside me. This was an emotional request that was not part of our agreement. It was a risk. If I gave in now, if I started spending my resource on these sentimental nonsense, the balance would be disturbed. Dear, I said in my best courtroom voice, the doctor said you need absolute rest. Conversations only tire you. I have provided you with the best care. That is the main thing. Rest. I did not take her hand. I only adjusted the edge of the blanket as if aligning a line in a document. I left the room, feeling proud of my steadfastness. I believed I was saving her from weakness. In reality, I was just driving another nail into the coffin of her will to live. Years passed. Her quiet fading was so aesthetic that I didn't even notice it. She became smaller, thinner, paler. Her paintings began to sell for insane money. People bought this sterile beauty, this vacuum in frames, feeling in it something familiar to their own emptiness. I became rich not only as a lawyer, but also as a manager of a great artist. She painted less and less often. In recent years, she simply sat by the window, looking at the garden. I hired the best gardeners to create an ideal landscape there, not a single extra blade of grass, not a single mistake of nature. Flowers grew by the ruler. "Do you like the garden?" I asked her once. "It's just like our life, Arthur," she replied without any intonation. "It's impossible to get lost in it, and nothing grows in it on its own." I took it as a compliment to my ability to organize space. I didn't notice the moment she finally stopped being a person and became a piece of furniture. Expensive, antique, very beautiful, but absolutely mute. Our emotional frugality led to total bankruptcy. We had everything, but we had nothing that could be felt with the touch of a heart. Every refusal of a hug, every "it's irrational" of mine, every scalpel of edits of mine cut away layer by layer of her life energy. She died quietly, on schedule. Even her death was professional. She caused me no trouble, made no scenes, demanded no confessions. She simply stopped breathing one night in October, just as restrained as she had lived for the last 30 years. I organized a flawless funeral, the best casket, the most exquisite flowers, the most influential guests. I stood by her grave, feeling a cold emptiness in my chest that I mistakenly took for stoicism. I was sure I had fulfilled my duty to the end. I was the architect of her life, and I had built her a magnificent mausoleum while she was still alive. Only now, sitting in this empty house with a silver spoon in my hand, am I beginning to realize that the mechanics of the years didn't just exhaust her. It exhausted the very essence of being. I saved on feeling so much that now I have nothing to pay for the right to feel even a drop of true grief. I am a professional beggar in a palace of golden edits. We lived like this for decades. A flawless marriage, a flawless career, a flawless desert inside. I was sure she took her secret to the grave, but today this house spoke. What I found in her old secretary turned my old age into hell in a single second. Are you ready to see the proof of my worthlessness that she hid for 40 years? I was sorting through her old secretary, a thing I thought I had fixed 40 years ago. I was looking for some property documents, something pragmatic, something that has a price on the market. But instead of securities, I found a small yellowed envelope hidden behind the back wall of a drawer. Inside was an artifact of my crime. It wasn't a photo. It was a sketch, a small scrap of paper on which the same stray kitten was drawn with quick, trembling lines. But the horror was not in the drawing itself. Underneath it, in Evelyn's small handwriting, was written only one phrase, dated the night of my operation. Today, Arthur killed the last person in me who knew how to love the imperfect. Now I will paint only what he can buy, my emptiness. These words hit me harder than any legal loss. I looked at this sketch, and suddenly the walls of my flawless office began to crumble. I saw the truth. I was not the architect of her success. I was her jailer. I was that very instrument as a cold weapon that cut away from her not mistakes, but the very ability to feel life. I remembered how she looked at me all those years. It wasn't respect. It was the numbness of a victim before a surgeon who operates without anesthesia. I saved on support, believing I was giving her stability. I saved on hugs, calling it restraint. I created a world for her where there was no pain, but there was no air in it either. I went to the window and looked at my perfect garden. It seemed like a cemetery to me. Every trimmed branch, every leveled bush is a monument to my desire to control what should be free. I am an 81-year-old lawyer who has won thousands of cases but lost the main trial of his life. I am an emotional beggar who has accumulated mountains of gold but is dying of thirst in the desert of his own correctness. And now I turn to you, those who still have time. Look at your loved ones. Look at them not as objects or assets. Do you see their flaws, their illogicality, their implausibility? I beg you, cherish these mistakes, because it is in these cracks that the soul lives. Do not try to fix them. Do not be surgeons where you simply need to be human. I spent 80 years creating a flawless form, and only now, holding this piece of paper in my hands, do I realize I am not just worthless. I am an empty space filled with expensive things. My occupational hazard has become my sentence. I saved on love so much that now I don't even have tears to mourn my own worthlessness. Do not be like me. Do not save on words. Do not fear an emotional deficit. Fear an emotional surplus that you never dared to spend. Because at the end of the road, neither accounts, nor status, nor logic will help you. You will be warmed only by the memory of how you allowed yourself to be weak, illogical, and alive. I am closing this secretary. I am closing my life. The silence in the house has become absolute. Now I know its real name. That name is death in life.